June 6, 1944, 8:47 in the morning, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The sound was controlled urgency, telephones ringing, map pins being moved, officers speaking in clipped, precise tones. This was the nerve center of Operation Overlord, and every person in the room understood they were witnessing history being written in real time. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood motionless before the massive wall map of the Normandy coastline, his hands clasped behind his back, his face an unreadable mask. Around him, his staff worked with mechanical efficiency, updating the invasion's progress based on fragmentary radio reports arriving from across the English Channel. 5 beaches, 5 simultaneous assaults: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, Juno. Each represented thousands of lives, months of planning, years of preparation. Each pin on that map was a soldier who might be alive or dead. Eisenhower had not slept in 36 hours. He had made the decision to launch the invasion despite terrible weather. If this failed, the responsibility was entirely his. He had already written the failure speech, sitting in his desk drawer, accepting full blame for the disaster. Now, he waited to see if he would need to deliver it. Commander Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, approached with a radio transcript. His face showed something Eisenhower had rarely seen in the normally composed officer. Shock, perhaps excitement. "General, this just came through from Admiral Vian's headquarters. It's about the Canadian sector at Juno Beach." Eisenhower took the paper. His eyes scanned the typed lines once, then again, more slowly. His eyebrows rose fractionally. His jaw tightened. For a man famous for maintaining composure under pressure, this was the equivalent of shouting. "When was this transmitted?" Eisenhower asked quietly. 0842, sir. 5 minutes ago. It's been confirmed by 2 independent observation posts and RAF reconnaissance." Eisenhower looked back at the map. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division had landed at Juno Beach at 0749, according to the schedule. The transcript in his hand, transmitted 53 minutes later, reported that Canadian forces had already broken through the coastal defenses and were advancing inland toward their first-day objectives. 53 minutes. From landing craft hitting the beach to breakthrough of the Atlantic Wall. 53 minutes. Every planning estimate, every war game, every intelligence assessment had calculated that breakthrough would take hours at minimum, possibly days. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to be Hitler's impregnable fortress: concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, mines, wire, beach obstacles. The Germans had spent 3 years fortifying these beaches, and the Canadians had punched through in less than an hour. Eisenhower turned to his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith. His voice was calm, but everyone in the room heard the underlying intensity. "Bedell, get me everything we have on the Canadian assault. I want to know exactly what happened at Juno Beach, not the summary, the details. How did they do it? This is not just the story of a military operation. This is the story of how the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe reacted when a Commonwealth division accomplished something that was supposed to be impossible. This is the story of what Eisenhower said, what he did, and how those 53 minutes at Juno Beach changed his entire understanding of what was possible in this war. Because Eisenhower's reaction was not just professional satisfaction at a successful assault, it was genuine astonishment that Canadian forces had rewritten the tactical assumptions underlying the entire invasion plan. And what he said in those first hours would shape how he commanded Allied forces for the rest of the war. The comment, "My God, they're through already," was not just an exclamation. It was the moment when Dwight Eisenhower understood that he had underestimated the capabilities of the forces under his command. And that realization would make him a better commander. To understand Eisenhower's reaction to the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach, you must first understand what he expected from D-Day. Dwight David Eisenhower was not a battlefield commander. He had never led troops in combat. He was a staff officer, a planner, a coordinator. His genius was not tactical, but organizational. He could manage the enormous complexity of a coalition operation involving multiple nations, services, and personalities. But this organizational genius came with a limitation. Eisenhower thought in terms of plans, logistics, and careful coordination. He was conservative in his operational estimates because he understood that optimistic planning killed soldiers. When the invasion was being planned in late 1943 and early 1944, Eisenhower's staff developed detailed timelines for each beach. These timelines were based on extensive intelligence about German defenses, analysis of previous amphibious operations, and input from tactical commanders. For Juno Beach, where the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division would land, the estimates were sobering. H-hour would be 07:45. The leading assault companies would hit the beach under fire, casualties would be heavy, the beach obstacles and German defensive fire would slow the advance. Engineers would need to clear paths through obstacles under fire. Infantry would need to suppress German bunkers. Tanks would need to breach the seawall. All of this would take time. The planning estimate suggested that Canadian forces might achieve breakthrough of the coastal defenses by late morning, possibly early afternoon. H+4 or H+5 hours was the optimistic estimate. H+6 or H+7 was more realistic. That meant between 11:30 and 14:30 hours, 4 to 7 hours, after the initial landing. This estimate was not pessimistic. It was based on what had happened at Dieppe in 1942, where Canadian forces had been slaughtered on the beaches. It was based on intelligence about the strength of German defenses at Juno Beach. It was based on the understanding that attacking fortified positions from the sea was one of the most difficult operations in warfare. Eisenhower accepted these estimates because they came from his professional staff and from British commanders who had experience with amphibious operations. He knew the assault would be costly. He knew it would be slow. He knew that the first day's objectives might not be reached. That was why he had written the failure speech. He was prepared for the possibility that the invasion might not succeed at all. But Eisenhower was also a pragmatist. He understood that plans were just estimates. Reality would differ from the plan. His job was to manage that difference, to adapt when things went wrong, and to exploit opportunities when things went right. On the morning of June 6th, Eisenhower was prepared for things to go wrong. He was not prepared for things to go spectacularly right. The first reports from Juno Beach were fragmentary and confused. This was normal. Communications in amphibious assaults were always chaotic. Radio equipment got wet, antennas were shot away, units were too busy fighting to send detailed reports. At 0800 hours, 15 minutes after H-hour at Juno Beach, the first report reached Southwick House. Canadian assault waves ashore, heavy opposition, casualties, fighting continuing. This was exactly what Eisenhower expected. Heavy opposition, casualties. It matched the plan. At 08:15, another report. Canadian forces engaging coastal defenses. Progress slower than planned due to obstacles and defensive fire. Again, this matched expectations. The phrase slower than planned was concerning but not alarming. All 5 beaches were reporting heavy fighting. Omaha Beach was already showing signs of being a disaster. The American forces there were pinned down, taking horrific casualties, unable to get off the beach. Utah Beach was going better, with lighter opposition than expected. Gold Beach and Sword Beach were both reporting progress, but also significant resistance. The overall picture was mixed. Some successes, some failures. Exactly the kind of confused situation that Eisenhower had to manage. But at 08:30, a report arrived that did not fit the pattern. Canadian units have broken through initial defensive positions and are advancing beyond the beach. Eisenhower's intelligence chief, British Major General Kenneth Strong, brought this report to his attention. "Sir, this is from a Royal Navy forward observer with the Canadian Assault Force. He reports that Canadian infantry and armor have penetrated the German defenses and are moving inland." Eisenhower studied the report. "What's their confidence level on this? Could it be an error?" Strong shook his head. "Sir, we have 3 independent confirmations now. Naval gunfire observers, RAF reconnaissance, and a Canadian beachmaster all reporting the same thing. The Canadians are through the coastal defenses and advancing." Eisenhower looked at the map. The pins marking Canadian positions were already being moved inland from Juno Beach. He checked his watch. 08:35, 46 minutes since H-hour. This was impossible, not difficult, not unlikely, impossible. No assault force could penetrate prepared defenses this quickly. The intelligence on German positions at Juno Beach was solid. There were bunkers, anti-tank guns, machine gun nests. These positions did not just disappear, yet the reports were consistent. The Canadians were not pinned on the beach. They were not fighting through the defenses. They were already beyond them. At 08:42, the report that Butcher brought to Eisenhower confirmed what the earlier reports had suggested. The Canadians had achieved breakthrough in 53 minutes. Eisenhower stood before the map, processing this information. Around him, his staff waited for his reaction. What the Supreme Commander said next would be quoted, remembered, and analyzed for decades. "My God," Eisenhower said quietly, They're through already. It was not a statement of fact. It was an expression of disbelief. Eisenhower had commanded millions of men. He had planned operations across continents. He had studied warfare his entire adult life, and he was genuinely shocked by what the Canadians had accomplished. Bedell Smith, standing beside him, said carefully, "Sir, the Canadian 3rd Division has apparently executed the assault with exceptional speed and aggression. The preliminary reports suggest they accepted heavy casualties, but maintained momentum." Eisenhower nodded slowly, still staring at the map. 53 minutes. Bedell, our estimates had them breaking. Through in 4 to 7 hours. They did it in less than an hour. How? Smith had no answer. Nobody in the room had an answer. The information was too new, too incomplete. But Eisenhower needed to understand. Because if the Canadians could do this at Juno Beach, what did that mean for the rest of the invasion? What did it mean for future operations? Eisenhower turned to his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull. "Get me a direct line to Montgomery's tactical headquarters. I want to speak with General Dempsey about the Canadian sector, and get someone from the Canadian division to debrief as soon as they can spare an officer." He turned back to the map, his mind already working through implications. If the Canadians are through this quickly, they'll be approaching Carpiquet Airfield before noon. That's a full day ahead of schedule. Do they have the logistical support to sustain that advance? Are follow-on units landing fast enough to reinforce them? These were the questions of a commander who understood that breakthrough meant nothing if it could not be exploited. The Canadians had done something remarkable, but could they hold what they had taken? Over the next hour, as more reports arrived from all 5 beaches, the situation at Juno Beach became clearer. The Canadian assault had succeeded through a combination of factors. Specialized armor had proven effective at clearing obstacles and suppressing bunkers. Canadian infantry had shown exceptional aggression, pushing through German positions without pausing to consolidate. Canadian officers had made good decisions quickly, adapting to conditions without waiting for orders from higher command. The casualties had been significant. Over 300 Canadians killed and 700 wounded in the first hours. But compared to the casualties at Omaha Beach, where thousands were dying for minimal gains, the Canadian losses were acceptable for what they had achieved. By 09:30, Eisenhower had assembled enough information to make his first assessment. He called a brief staff meeting in the operations room. "Gentlemen, the situation at Juno Beach is developing in ways we did not anticipate. The Canadian 3rd Division has achieved breakthrough of German coastal defenses in approximately 1 hour. This is significantly faster than our planning estimates suggested was possible." He pointed to the map. "This success creates both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity is that we have a breach in the Atlantic Wall that can be exploited immediately. The challenge is that our follow-on plans assumed a longer time frame for breakthrough. We need to accelerate everything. Landing schedules, logistics, reinforcements. The Canadians have opened a door. We need to get forces through that door before the Germans can close it." Eisenhower's chief logistician spoke up. "Sir, the landing schedules are already compressed to the limit. We cannot accelerate significantly without risking chaos on the beaches." Eisenhower nodded. "I understand, but we need to try. The Canadians have given us an opportunity we did not expect to have this early. We cannot waste it because our logistics are not flexible enough." This was Eisenhower's first major decision based on the Canadian breakthrough. Push the logistics beyond the plan. Accept some chaos on the beaches in exchange for maintaining momentum inland. It was a calculated risk, but it showed that Eisenhower understood the value of what the Canadians had achieved. By 1000 hours, Eisenhower had received the first detailed after-action reports from Juno Beach. These reports came from Canadian beachmasters, naval observers, and Royal Air Force pilots who had flown reconnaissance over the assault area. The picture they painted was extraordinary. The Canadian 7th and 8th Infantry Brigades had landed under heavy fire. The beach obstacles had been more extensive than intelligence suggested. The German defensive fire had been accurate and intense, but the Canadians had not stopped. When landing craft hit obstacles and were damaged, soldiers jumped into chest-deep water and waded ashore under fire. When tanks got stuck on the shingle, infantry advanced without armor support. When officers were killed, sergeants took command and kept the assault moving. The specialized armor, particularly the flail tanks that cleared mines and the armored vehicles, Royal Engineers that destroyed obstacles, had proven critical. But even more important was the Canadian refusal to go to ground on the beach. Standard British doctrine, learned from years of methodical warfare, emphasized consolidation, take an objective, secure it, bring up support, then advance to the next objective. The Canadians had ignored this doctrine. They had simply kept moving forward, through the obstacles, through the German fire, through the defenses. And that momentum, that refusal to pause, had carried them through the Atlantic Wall before. The Germans could react effectively. Eisenhower read these reports with growing fascination. He had always understood warfare in terms of careful planning and methodical execution. The Canadian assault represented something different. It was planned, yes, but it was also intuitive, aggressive, almost reckless, and it had worked. At 10:30 hours, Eisenhower received a personal report from Brigadier General James Hill, a British airborne officer who had been observing the Canadian assault from a reconnaissance aircraft. Hill had landed at a temporary airstrip behind the beaches and sent a detailed dispatch to Supreme Headquarters. Hill's report included a passage that Eisenhower would remember for the rest of his life. The Canadian assault at Juno Beach was the most aggressive and effective amphibious operation I have witnessed. The troops showed exceptional courage and determination, but more than that, they showed initiative at every level. Junior officers and NCOs made decisions. Without waiting for orders, units adapted to obstacles without requesting guidance. The result was an assault that never lost momentum. The Germans were not defeated by superior firepower. They were overwhelmed by an enemy that would not stop moving. Eisenhower put down the report and looked at Bedell Smith. That's what we've been missing. Initiative, aggression, the willingness to keep moving even when the plan falls apart. Smith nodded carefully. Sir, with respect, we've emphasized those qualities in our training and doctrine. Eisenhower shook his head. We've emphasized them in theory. But in practice, we've built an army that waits for orders, that consolidates before advancing, that values organization over momentum. The Canadians showed us what happens when you actually implement aggressive doctrine. This was a moment of self-reflection for Eisenhower. He was realizing that his own cautious nature, his emphasis on careful planning and coordination, might have made him undervalue the importance of speed and aggression in operations. At 1100 hours, Eisenhower made a decision that would influence Allied operations for the rest of the Normandy campaign. He drafted a message to all beach commanders and corps commanders. The message was brief, but significant. Canadian success at Juno Beach demonstrates the value of maintaining momentum in amphibious assault. All commanders are encouraged to exploit breakthrough opportunities aggressively rather than pausing to consolidate. Speed and violence of action are proving more effective than methodical advance. Supreme Commander sends congratulations to Canadian 3rd Division for exceptional performance. This message did several things. First, it gave official recognition to Canadian achievement, which was important for coalition politics. Second, it communicated to other commanders that Eisenhower valued aggressive action. Third, it implicitly acknowledged that the planning estimates had been too conservative. But most importantly, it showed that Eisenhower was willing to learn from what had happened and adjust his approach accordingly. By midday on June 6th, the situation across all 5 beaches had clarified. Utah Beach was secure, with American forces pushing inland. Omaha Beach remained a crisis, with forces still fighting to get off the beach. Gold Beach and Sword Beach were both successful, with British forces consolidating their positions. And Juno Beach was the deepest penetration of the day, with Canadians already engaging German reserves miles inland. Eisenhower, monitoring these reports, kept returning to the Canadian sector. The contrast between Omaha and Juno was particularly striking. Both beaches had faced strong opposition, both had taken casualties, but the outcomes were dramatically different. At Omaha, American forces had gone to ground under fire, they had sought cover, they had waited for support, and they had nearly failed. At Juno, Canadian forces had kept moving. They had accepted casualties, they had pushed through, and they had succeeded. The difference was not in the quality of the soldiers. American troops were brave and well-trained. The difference was in approach. The Americans had fought a defensive battle on an assault beach. The Canadians had fought an offensive battle from the moment they landed. Eisenhower understood this difference, and it would influence how he thought about operations for the rest of the war. At 1300 hours, Eisenhower spoke with General Bernard Montgomery, the ground forces commander for the invasion. Montgomery was at his tactical headquarters in England, monitoring the battle through radio reports. "Monty, I want to talk about the Canadian sector," Eisenhower said. "Your thoughts on their performance?" Montgomery, never one to share credit easily, was nonetheless impressed. "The Canadians have done exceptionally well, Ike. Better than I dared hope. They've got the bit between their teeth and they're running with it. The question now is whether they can hold what they have taken when the Germans counterattack." Eisenhower nodded. "What support do they need?" "More armor, more artillery. The Germans will throw everything at them. The Canadians are exposed. Their flanks are open because they've advanced so far ahead of the British sectors. We need to get reinforcements to them quickly." Eisenhower made another decision. Pull resources from the other beaches if necessary. The Canadians have created an opportunity. We exploit it. Anything they need, they get priority. This was a significant command decision. Eisenhower was effectively betting on the Canadian breakthrough. He was committing resources that might be needed elsewhere to reinforce the fastest advancing sector. It was the kind of bold decision that Eisenhower had not been known for making. But the Canadian example had taught him something. Fortune favors the aggressive. By evening on June 6th, Eisenhower had received comprehensive reports from all invasion beaches. The picture was mixed. Omaha Beach had finally been secured, but at terrible cost. The other beaches were all successful to varying degrees, but Juno Beach stood out. The Canadians had penetrated further inland than any other Allied force. They had seized the village of Courcelles. They were approaching Carpiquet Airfield. They had achieved most of their first-day objectives, something no other beach had accomplished. The German reaction was also telling. German commanders monitoring the invasion had identified the Canadian sector as the most dangerous threat. They were rushing reinforcements, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division, to counterattack the Canadian penetration. This was exactly what Eisenhower wanted. If the Germans were focusing on the Canadian sector, they were not reinforcing Omaha or the other beaches. The Canadian breakthrough was drawing German attention and resources away from more vulnerable Allied positions. At 1800 hours, Eisenhower sat down to write his first end-of-day assessment of the invasion. This assessment would be sent to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. It would be read by Churchill and Roosevelt. It would become part of the historical record. Eisenhower chose his words carefully. Operation Overlord has successfully established Allied forces on the coast of France. All 5 beaches are secured. Casualties are within acceptable limits, though higher at some beaches than others. Progress varies by sector, but overall situation is favorable. Then he added a paragraph specifically about the Canadian achievement. Special mention must be made of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division at Juno Beach. This formation achieved breakthrough of German coastal defenses with remarkable speed, penetrating inland to their first-day objectives in approximately 6 hours. This is significantly ahead of planning estimates and represents the deepest Allied penetration on D-Day. The Canadian success demonstrates the effectiveness of specialized armor, aggressive tactics, and exceptional leadership at all levels. Their performance provides a model for future amphibious operations. This paragraph was more than just praise. It was Eisenhower acknowledging that the Canadians had taught him something, that the planning estimates had been wrong, that aggressive action worked better than he had believed. That evening, Eisenhower walked outside Southwick House. The grounds were quiet. The invasion was launched. There was nothing more he could do tonight except wait for tomorrow's reports. As he stood in the darkness, smoking a cigarette, Commander Butcher joined him. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Eisenhower spoke. "Harry, I've been thinking about the Canadians all day, about what they accomplished, and I keep coming back to one thought." "What's that, sir?" "We almost didn't let them try it. We almost postponed the invasion because of weather. We almost told them to wait, to be cautious, to go slow. And if we had, they probably would have failed. But we gave them a chance. We let them go. And they showed us what's possible when you just let good soldiers do their job." Butcher nodded. "They were remarkable, sir." "They were more than remarkable, Harry. They were instructive. I learned something today. I learned that I've been too cautious, too focused on what can go wrong. The Canadians showed me that sometimes you just have to trust your people and let them surprise you." This conversation, recorded in Butcher's diary and published years later, revealed Eisenhower's thinking in a private moment. The Canadian breakthrough had not just succeeded tactically, it had changed how Eisenhower thought about command. Over the following days, as the Battle of Normandy developed, Eisenhower continued to reference the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach. In meetings with his staff, he would ask, "What did the Canadians do differently? Why did they succeed when others struggled? How do we replicate their success? On June 7th, D+1, Eisenhower received detailed casualty figures from all beaches. Juno Beach had lost approximately 340 killed and 700 wounded on D-Day. These were significant casualties, but in the context of what they had achieved, the losses were acceptable. Omaha Beach, by contrast, had suffered over 2,000 casualties for much more limited gains. Eisenhower studied these figures and made a calculation that would have shocked people who thought of him as cautious. The Canadian approach, accepting casualties to maintain momentum, actually saved lives overall, because the faster you broke through, the less time the enemy had to inflict casualties. The methodical approach, trying to minimize losses through careful advances, actually resulted in more casualties over time because it gave the enemy more opportunities to kill your soldiers. This was counterintuitive, but the numbers from June 6th supported it. On June 8th, Eisenhower visited the Normandy beachhead for the first time. He toured Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, speaking with American commanders and soldiers. Then he insisted on visiting the Canadian sector, despite staff concerns about the ongoing fighting there. When Eisenhower arrived at Canadian headquarters near Courseulles, he met with Major General Rod Keller, commander of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Keller was exhausted, having commanded the division through 3 days of continuous combat, but he was also proud of what his men had achieved. Eisenhower shook Keller's hand. "General, I wanted to come here personally to thank you and your men. What you accomplished on D-Day was extraordinary. You did something we thought would take most of the day in less than an hour. How did you do it?" Keller, a straightforward officer not given to false modesty, gave an honest answer. "Sir, we did what we were trained to do. We attacked. We kept attacking. When things went wrong, we adapted. When officers fell, sergeants took over. The men knew they had to get off that beach or die on it, so they got off it. Simple as that." Eisenhower nodded. "But it's not simple, General. Other beaches had equally brave men, but they didn't achieve what you achieved. There's something different about how your division fights." Keller thought for a moment. "Sir, if there's a difference, it's that we don't wait for permission. We train our junior leaders to make decisions. We tell them the objective and trust them to figure out how to achieve it. On D-Day, that meant they kept pushing forward even when communications broke down, even when the plan fell apart. They improvised. That's what made the difference." This conversation, documented in Eisenhower's personal diary, captured what he had learned from the Canadian breakthrough: decentralized command, trust in junior leaders, willingness to improvise. These were principles Eisenhower believed in theoretically, but seeing them work in practice, seeing the results they produced, made him commit to implementing them more seriously throughout Allied forces. On June 10th, Eisenhower held a conference of senior commanders at his headquarters in England. The purpose was to assess the first 5 days of the invasion and plan next steps. When the discussion turned to lessons learned, Eisenhower brought up Juno Beach. "Gentlemen, I want to talk about what the Canadians did on D-Day, because I think it has implications for how we conduct operations going forward." He described the Canadian breakthrough, the speed of their advance, and the casualties they had accepted to maintain momentum. "The lesson I take from this is that in amphibious operations, speed matters more than we've acknowledged. The side that moves fastest usually wins, not the side with the best plan, not the side with the most careful coordination, the side that acts while the enemy is still reacting." He looked around the room at American, British, and Canadian commanders. "We need to be more aggressive, all of us. The Germans are professional soldiers. They're good at what they do, but they can be beaten by speed and violence of action. The Canadians proved that." This was Eisenhower's public acknowledgement of what he had learned, and it would influence Allied operations throughout the summer of 1944. When planning the breakout from Normandy in late July, Operation Cobra, Eisenhower emphasized the importance of exploiting breakthrough rapidly. When planning the advance across France in August, he pushed his commanders to maintain momentum even when logistics were strained. And when planning the crossing of the Rhine in 1945, he used the Juno Beach example to argue for aggressive exploitation of any bridgehead. In each case, the lesson was the same. Breakthrough is possible, speed is essential, aggression pays. These principles, learned from watching what the Canadians accomplished in 53 minutes on June 6th, shaped Eisenhower's command philosophy for the rest of the war. By late June, as the Battle of Normandy settled into a grinding attritional phase, Eisenhower's initial excitement about the Canadian breakthrough had been tempered by the realities of the campaign. The Canadians had not maintained their rapid advance, the Germans had reinforced, and the front lines had stabilized. But Eisenhower never forgot what the Canadians had accomplished on D-Day, and he never stopped referring to it as proof of what was possible. On June 20th, in a meeting with Churchill and Roosevelt at Supreme Headquarters, the Prime Minister asked Eisenhower about the progress of the campaign. Eisenhower gave an honest assessment. Progress was slower than hoped. The terrain favored defense. The Germans were fighting skillfully. But then he added something that revealed his thinking. However, Prime Minister, I remain optimistic, because I saw what our forces can do when conditions are right. The Canadians at Juno Beach showed me that the German defenses can be broken quickly by well-trained, aggressive troops. We just need to create the conditions for that to happen again. Churchill, always interested in Canadian contributions to the war effort, nodded. The Canadians have done magnificently. But what specifically did they do that was different? Eisenhower thought carefully before answering. They refused to be stopped. That sounds simple, but it's profound. In war, most failures happen because someone decides to stop. The attack stalls. The commander pauses to reassess. The troops take cover. The Canadians on D-Day never stopped. From the moment they landed until they reached their objectives, they kept moving forward. That momentum broke the German defense. This explanation, recorded in the minutes of the meeting, showed how Eisenhower had internalized the lesson of Juno Beach. It was not about tactics or technology. It was about will. About refusing to be stopped, about maintaining momentum regardless of obstacles. In July, Eisenhower wrote a letter to General Andrew McNaughton, the senior Canadian Army officer in Britain. The letter thanked McNaughton for the Canadian contribution to the invasion and specifically mentioned Juno Beach. The performance of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on D-Day set a standard for amphibious operations that will be studied for generations. They proved that speed and aggression can overcome even the strongest defenses. Please convey my deepest respect and gratitude to all ranks of the Canadian Army. This was not diplomatic flattery. Eisenhower meant it. Throughout the remainder of the war, he consistently praised Canadian forces and gave them difficult missions because he trusted them to execute aggressively. By August, when Allied forces finally broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, Eisenhower's strategic thinking had been fundamentally influenced by what he learned from the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach. He pushed his commanders to maintain pace. He accepted risks that he would not have accepted before D-Day. He trusted his subordinates to make decisions without waiting for detailed orders from Supreme Headquarters. All of these changes could be traced back to those 53 minutes on June 6th, when the Canadians rewrote Eisenhower's understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. After the war, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, Eisenhower devoted significant attention to D-Day. When discussing Juno Beach, he wrote with unusual emotion for a man known for understated prose. The Canadian assault at Juno Beach was one of the most impressive feats of arms I witnessed during the war. In less than an hour, they accomplished what our planning staffs believed would require most of a day. Their success was not luck. It was the result of superb training, exceptional leadership, aggressive tactics, and the fighting spirit of the Canadian soldier. When I learned they were through the coastal defenses so quickly, I confess I was astonished. It forced me to reconsider many of my assumptions about amphibious warfare and about the capabilities of the forces under my command. Eisenhower went on to analyze what made the Canadian assault successful. He credited the specialized armor. He credited the aggressive doctrine. But most of all, he credited what he called the human factor. The Canadians succeeded because every man, from the division commander to the newest private, understood that hesitation meant death. They landed on that beach knowing they had to get off it immediately or die on it. That simple, brutal clarity of purpose drove everything they did. They did not pause to consider options. They did not wait for perfect conditions. They simply attacked, and that attack never stopped until they reached their objectives. This analysis, written with the benefit of hindsight and access to complete records, confirmed what Eisenhower had said on the morning of June 6th. The Canadians had taught him something fundamental about warfare. In 1952, Eisenhower was asked during a lecture at Columbia University, where he served as president, about the most surprising moments of World War II. His answer referenced Juno Beach immediately. I expected D-Day to be difficult. I expected casualties. I expected slow progress and hard fighting. What I did not expect was for any single division to achieve breakthrough of the Atlantic Wall in under an hour. When I received the report that the Canadians at Juno Beach were already through the coastal defenses, my first reaction was disbelief. It seemed impossible. But it happened, and it taught me a valuable lesson about underestimating what good soldiers can do. A student asked what specific lesson Eisenhower had learned. His answer was characteristically thoughtful. I learned that leaders often become obstacles to their own forces. We create conservative plans because we fear failure. We emphasize caution because we fear casualties. But sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is be cautious. The Canadians were bold, they were aggressive, they accepted risk, and they succeeded because of it, not in spite of it. That's a lesson every commander should learn. In 1967, Eisenhower was interviewed by a military historian about the Normandy invasion. The historian asked specifically about the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach and whether it had influenced Eisenhower's later command decisions. Eisenhower, now in his late 70s and speaking with the candor of retirement, gave a remarkably frank answer. Juno Beach changed how I thought about commanding. Before D-Day, I thought my job was to plan perfectly and coordinate carefully. After seeing what the Canadians did, I realized my job was to give good people clear objectives and then get out of their way. Trust them to figure out the details. That insight made me a better commander. The historian pressed him on this point. Sir, are you saying the Canadian success was due to less command interference? Eisenhower laughed. I'm saying it was due to trusting junior leaders to make decisions. Rod Keller gave his brigade commanders clear objectives. They gave their battalion commanders clear objectives. Those battalion commanders trusted their company commanders, and those company commanders trusted their sergeants. By the time the assault happened, every man knew what needed to be done and was empowered to do it. That's why they moved so fast. Nobody was waiting for orders from above. This interview, recorded and transcribed, revealed Eisenhower's mature reflection on the lessons of Juno Beach. It was not about tactics or equipment, it was about trust and empowerment. In his final years, Eisenhower occasionally reflected on the Canadian breakthrough in private conversations with friends and fellow veterans. One such conversation, recorded by General Omar Bradley in his own memoirs, was particularly revealing. Eisenhower and Bradley were discussing the Normandy campaign over drinks. Bradley asked Eisenhower what his single most vivid memory of D-Day was. Eisenhower thought for a long moment before answering. The moment I learned the Canadians were through at Juno Beach. It was less than an hour after they landed. I was looking at the map and someone brought me the report. I remember thinking, this can't be right. But it was. And in that moment, I realized we had underestimated everyone. Not just the Canadians, all of our forces. We had planned for what we thought was possible, but our soldiers showed us what was actually possible. That gap between our expectations and their achievement, that's what I remember most clearly. Bradley asked whether that realization changed how Eisenhower commanded. Absolutely. From that point forward, I was less concerned with constraining what our forces did and more concerned with enabling what they could do. The Canadians showed me that the limiting factor was not their capability. It was my willingness to let them demonstrate that capability. This conversation, taking place years after the war, showed that the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach was not just a tactical success, but a teaching moment that influenced Eisenhower for the rest of his life. The legacy of the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach extended beyond Eisenhower's personal evolution as a commander. It influenced how the American military thought about amphibious operations for decades. When the Marine Corps developed new doctrine for amphibious assaults in the 1950s and 60s, Juno Beach was studied extensively. The lessons were clear. Specialized equipment helps but is not sufficient. Aggressive tactics are essential. Momentum must be maintained. At all costs, casualties must be accepted to prevent greater casualties later. These principles, derived partly from analyzing the Canadian success at Juno Beach, shaped American amphibious doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. When analyzing Eisenhower's statement, "My God, they're through already," military historians have debated what it reveals about his command style and personality. Some argue it shows Eisenhower was overly cautious and had underestimated Allied capabilities. Others argue it shows appropriate surprise at an exceptional outcome that exceeded reasonable expectations. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Eisenhower was cautious by nature and by training. He was a staff officer who had risen through planning and coordination rather than battlefield command. His instinct was to prepare for the worst and be pleasantly surprised by better outcomes. The Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach did surprise him. It exceeded his expectations. But rather than dismissing it as luck or an anomaly, Eisenhower had the wisdom to learn from it. He adjusted his thinking. He became more willing to trust aggressive action. He gave his commanders more freedom to exploit opportunities. These changes, driven partly by the lessons of Juno Beach, made him a more effective supreme commander. By the time Allied forces were advancing into Germany in 1945, Eisenhower's command style had evolved significantly from what it had been on June 6, 1944. He was bolder, more willing to accept risk, more trusting of his subordinates, and some of that evolution could be traced directly back to 53 minutes at Juno Beach, when Canadian soldiers taught their supreme commander that his careful plans underestimated what was possible. Today, the story of the Canadian breakthrough at Juno Beach is overshadowed by the drama of Omaha Beach and the larger narrative of D-Day. But for Eisenhower, Juno Beach was the key teaching moment of the invasion. It was where he learned that bold action succeeds more reliably than careful caution. It was where he learned to trust his subordinates to improvise and adapt. It was where he learned that the limiting factor in military operations is often the commander's willingness to let good soldiers do what they are trained to do. Eisenhower's exclamation, "My God, they're through already," was not just surprise at Canadian speed. It was the moment when a careful planner realized that his plans had been too conservative, his estimates too cautious, his understanding of what was possible too limited. The Canadians did not just break through the Atlantic Wall in 53 minutes. They broke through Eisenhower's assumptions about warfare, and in doing so, they helped create the commander who would lead Allied forces to victory in Europe. That is the untold story of what Eisenhower said when Canada blitzed through Juno Beach. Not just words of surprise, but a revelation that changed how one of history's great commanders understood his role and his forces. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division gave Eisenhower more than a successful beach landing. They gave him a lesson in leadership that would echo through the rest of the war and into his later career as NATO commander and President of the United States. Trust your people. Give them clear objectives. Get out of their way. And be prepared to be surprised by what they accomplish. That is what 53 minutes at Juno Beach taught Dwight Eisenhower. And that is why, 70 years later, military commanders still study those minutes and try to understand how a single division from a small nation taught the supreme commander of Allied forces what was truly possible when you trust good soldiers to do extraordinary things. The Canadians at Juno Beach did not just open a breach in Hitler's Atlantic Wall, they opened Eisenhower's eyes to the capabilities of the forces under his command. And that may have been their greatest contribution to Allied victory.